They handed her soap instead of a gun. That was the moment Yoshida Fumiko, 24 years old, a third-year medical student from Tokyo, realized that everything she had been taught about America might be wrong. Not the canteen of water, not the clean sheets, not even the food, the soap. A bar of ivory soap, pale yellow, hard-smelling, of nothing natural. Nothing like flowers, nothing like herbs, just clean. The kind of soap that sat in the bathroom of every American home like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. For Fumiko, it was the most terrifying thing she had ever held. Because if the enemy gave you soap instead of a rifle, if they stepped back and waited for you to decide whether to trust them, if they treated you like a patient instead of a prisoner, then everything you had believed for 3 years, everything you had been willing to die for, every lie you had swallowed without question, was exactly that, a lie. This is the story of 37 Japanese women who walked out of a cave expecting death and found something far more disorienting: kindness. And what that kindness cost them, not in blood, but in the complete destruction of the world as they understood it. If this story moves, you stay with me to the end. Because the ending 40 years later in a letter, read aloud in a quiet room, will stay with you a long time. Okinawa in July of 1945 did not look like an island anymore. 3 months of the most brutal ground combat in the Pacific Theater had turned what was once a place of green hills and sugarcane fields and small white coral villages into something that looked like the surface of the moon. Palm trees stood as charred spikes. The smell of death had soaked into the soil so deep that the summer heat pulled it back up every morning, mixing with salt air from the ocean and smoke from fires that were still burning in the ruins of things that used to be homes. For those of you who had fathers or grandfathers who served in the Pacific, you already know something about what that kind of fighting does to a landscape and to the men who have to move through it. Okinawa was not a battle. It was erasure. More than 110,000 Japanese soldiers died defending that island. More than 12,000 Americans died taking it. And somewhere between 80 and 100,000 Okinawan civilians, people who lived on that land, who had farmed it and fished its waters and built their homes on its hillsides, died, caught between 2 armies that were fighting over their home. By early July, the organized resistance was finished. The Japanese Imperial Army had been ground down to its last remnants. American forces controlled the island, but the fighting was not entirely over, because the fighting in a war like that is never entirely over all at once. There were still pockets of Japanese soldiers hiding in the limestone caves that honeycombed the southern cliffs of the island. Some still had weapons. Some were waiting for orders that would never come. Some were simply waiting because they had been told that surrender was worse than death, and they had believed it. Somewhere in those caves, in the darkness and the heat and the smell of 3 months of survival, 37 young Japanese women were waiting too. Their name was the Himeyuri Student Corps. Let me tell you who they were because this matters. In March of 1945, when American forces landed on Okinawa and the Japanese military knew the battle for the island had begun in earnest, an order went out to 2 all-girls schools in the city of Naha. The Daiichi Okinawa Girls High School and the Okinawa Normal School for Women. Approximately 240 students and teachers, girls as young as 15 and women as old as their mid-20s, were mobilized to serve as auxiliary nurses in the Japanese Army's field hospitals. They were called Himeyuri, a name that combined the names of their 2 schools. In Japanese, it carried the image of the princess lily flower. It was a name that sounded like something delicate and beautiful. What they were asked to do was neither delicate nor beautiful. They were sent underground into the limestone cave systems beneath the southern cliffs of Okinawa to assist military surgeons in field hospitals carved out of solid rock. They worked by candlelight. They held soldiers as those soldiers died. They cleaned wounds with salt water when nothing else was available. They sang quietly to boys their own age who wept for their mothers in the dark. They did this for 3 months while the world above them was being destroyed. When the Japanese defensive line collapsed in mid-June and the battle was effectively lost, the military command issued a sudden order dissolving the Himeyuri Corps. Just like that. No weapons, no instructions, no plan for what these girls were supposed to do next. They were simply released into a war zone and told that the unit no longer existed. More than half of the Himeyuri members died in the days that followed. Some were killed by artillery shells. Some died of disease after weeks of malnutrition underground. Some chose to end their own lives rather than face capture because they had been told clearly and repeatedly by teachers and officers and newspapers and government films that capture by American soldiers meant something worse than death. 37 of them survived by hiding. They found the deepest caves they could in the cliffs at the southern tip of the island, a place called Cayenne Point. And they went as far in as possible, and they waited. Now I want you to think about who these 37 women actually were. Yoshida Fumiko was the oldest at 24. She was the daughter of a doctor from Tokyo. She had gotten into medical school, which in 1941 was not something women did easily, and she had been studying surgery when the war made her into something else entirely. In the caves, she had become the informal leader of the group, not because she was appointed, not because she outranked anyone, but because she was the one who kept making decisions when everyone else had stopped. She carried one belief that had not broken down even after 3 months underground. Her father had told her when she was a girl sitting in his clinic in Tokyo watching him work. The hands of a doctor do not belong to their country. They belong to the person who is placing their life in them. She had held on to that sentence like a rope in the dark. Nakamura Setsuko was 16 years old. She was from Naha, the capital city of Okinawa, which meant that she was hiding in a cave beneath her own hometown. Her father was a fisherman. Her mother taught elementary school. She had been in her first year at the Daiichi Girls' School when the mobilization order came. She was 15 at the time. She turned 16 in April in the cave on a birthday that nobody remembered, including her. Setsuko had developed a habit in the caves. When something became unbearable, when the shelling got too close, or someone died on the improvised operating table, or the darkness pressed down too hard, she would whisper the same phrase to herself over and over. Please, not again. She did not know exactly what she meant by it. She only knew that saying it gave her enough time to take one more breath. There was a third woman in that group who matters to this story. Her name was Oshiro Chiyo. She was 19 years old, and she was Okinawan in a way that Fumiko and Setsuko were not, because her family had been on that island for generations. She knew the cave systems the way you know the layout of your childhood home in the dark. She knew which seaweed growing on the cave walls was safe to eat and which was not. She knew how to read the echoes of artillery to figure out which direction the shells were coming from. Chiyo also knew something that the others either did not know or had chosen not to think about. She had seen how the Japanese military treated Okinawan civilians during those 3 months of battle. She had heard stories about Japanese soldiers pushing local people out of caves to make room for troops. She had heard about civilian Okinawans being shot by Japanese forces, sometimes for trying to surrender, sometimes simply because someone decided they might be spies. Okinawans had been Japanese citizens for decades, and in those caves, they had discovered exactly how much that citizenship was worth when the military needed the space. Chiyo said none of this out loud in the caves. It was too dangerous. But she filed it away. And when the smoke grenades came on the morning of July 3rd, and the white smoke began filling the tunnels, her calculations were different from everyone else's. The smoke grenades were not intended to kill them. The American forces outside knew people were in the cave and chose smoke over something lethal. In the context of everything happening on that island, that was itself a decision worth noticing. Fumiko was the first one to understand what was happening. She had been awake for most of the previous night. She was sitting near the cave entrance with her back against the stone wall when the smoke began to drift in thin at first, and then thicker, stinging her eyes and throat. She stood up. Around her, the other women were waking, coughing, some beginning to cry quietly in the dark. She could see the shapes of them in the dim light that was starting to filter in from outside, gray and formless. Reiko was the one who said it directly. Tanaka Reiko, 21 years old, from Osaka, the most ideologically committed person in the group. She had never questioned a single thing she had been taught. Not once. She said, if we go out there, we are traitors. We dishonor everyone who died. Fumiko looked at her. She thought about what to say. Then she said simply, the people who died do not need us to die with them. Chiyo was already on her feet. She walked to the entrance. She turned and looked at the group and said something in the Okinawan dialect, slower and older than standard Japanese, that not everyone understood fully. But the tone carried. We go now. Together. Fumiko took the lead. She walked to the entrance of the cave into the thickening smoke and raised her hands above her head. She kept her eyes shut. Not from fear, though fear was present in every part of her body. She kept them shut because after 3 months in near total darkness, the light of a July morning in Okinawa was a physical assault. Her eyes filled with tears instantly, not from emotion, but from simple biology, the reflexive response of pupils that had forgotten how to contract. She shouted the only 2 words of English she could remember from her medical school language requirement words she had learned for an entirely different purpose. No fight, no fight. Behind her, the other 36 women followed, some praying out loud, some in complete silence. Setsuko was somewhere in the middle of the group. She walked out with her eyes open, forcing herself to see because she had decided that whatever was about to happen, she would not face it blind. She kept whispering, "Please not again, please not again." The sunlight hit them like a wall. They stood at the cave entrance, blinking and squinting. Hands raised 37 figures in tattered white nursing uniforms that had long since stopped being white-gray, now with dirt and old blood, some missing shoes, feet wrapped in strips of cloth. They must have looked like something from a nightmare, or from a photograph that no one ever wanted to take. American soldiers in green uniforms stood in a loose formation on the hillside. Rifles were raised. Faces were unreadable behind the squinting caused by sun and exhaustion and 3 months of a war that had cost them things they would spend decades trying not to think about. For a moment, nothing moved. Both groups simply looked at each other. Fumiko looked at the soldiers and tried to see the monsters she had been told were there. The propaganda films had been very specific, very detailed. She had watched them in lecture halls at the university, had seen the images of American brutality, had heard the descriptions of what happened to prisoners, to women especially. Those images were inside her somewhere, still available, still vivid. But the man standing closest to her was perhaps 22 years old, and he looked like he had not slept in a week and a half, and his expression was not cruelty. It was something harder to interpret. It was the face of someone doing a job that had cost him more than he expected, and who was now looking at 37 exhausted women with their hands in the air and trying to figure out what came next. He unscrewed his canteen. He held it out toward Fumiko. She did not move. He looked at her. Then he placed the canteen on the ground between them gently, the way you might set down a tool near someone who is afraid of tools. Then he stepped back, 3 full steps backward, leaving space. That detail, that specific gesture of stepping backward. Fumiko noticed it the way you notice something that does not fit the pattern you expected. In everything she had been told, in every image she had been shown, the enemy advanced. The enemy pressed forward. The enemy did not step back and wait. She was a doctor's daughter and a medical student, and she had been trained to observe. She observed this. She bent down slowly and picked up the canteen. She unscrewed the cap. She brought it to her nose first because her hands did what they needed to do before her mind caught up. It smelled like water, only water, cold metal and clean water. She drank. The water hit her throat after 3 months of algae green cave water and boiled seaweed and desperation, and the sensation was so acute, it was almost painful, the way any extreme sensation becomes pain when the body has been deprived long enough. She lowered the canteen, looked at it, looked at the soldier who had stepped back to give her room. She passed the canteen to Setsuko. Setsuko took it with both hands. She drank with her eyes wide open, and the water ran down her chin, and she kept her eyes open the whole time because she had decided to see everything, every detail, every piece of evidence for the thing she could not yet name. Other canteens appeared, other soldiers setting them down, stepping back. The message traveling through the group without words, without a translator, without any language except the language of an object placed on the ground and a person moving away from it. Chio drank last. She held the canteen for a moment before drinking and looked at the hillside around her. At the American soldiers who had chosen smoke over something lethal. At the canteens being offered without conditions. At the absence of what she had been promised would be there. Then she drank. They were led down the hillside in a loose group, their hands still raised, though no one was requiring it anymore. The soldiers walked alongside them, not behind, with weapons pointed alongside. The path took them through the wreckage of 3 months of war. Burned-out vehicles. Shell craters so deep they looked like wells. A stone torii gate from a Shinto shrine that no longer existed, still standing somehow in the middle of nothing, framing a view of rubble and ash. Setsuko saw a man she recognized as they passed through an area where Japanese prisoners were being processed. Higa Masao. He was 20 years old, the older brother of her classmate Michiko from school. She had last seen him in March in his army uniform, standing at attention at the bus station in Naha, looking like someone who believed completely in what he was about to do. Now he was sitting on the ground with his head down and his shoes missing his feet, wrapped in burlap, and the absolute stillness of a person who has run out of whatever was keeping them going. Setsuko wanted to call out to him. The group moved past before she could. But she had seen him. He was alive. In 3 months of darkness and dying, this was the first person she knew that she had seen alive. That small fact lodged somewhere in her chest, like a splinter sharp enough to feel, but too small to name. The field hospital had been set up in what had been a schoolyard. The building itself was gone. Only the foundation remained, a concrete outline of something that used to be where children learn things. On that foundation and around it, the Americans had erected a small city of canvas tents, connected by duckboards laid across the mud. Red crosses marked the medical tents. A generator ran somewhere nearby, and above the tents, electric lights burned in the afternoon. Setsuko stopped walking when she saw those lights. She had not seen electric light in 3 months. She had lived by candle and by darkness, and by the occasional flicker of a lighter held up so a surgeon could see what needed to be cut. Ordinary electric light, the kind that burns over kitchen tables and in hospital hallways, had become something she had started to think of as part of another life, one that may or may not have still been happening somewhere. She stood and looked at the lights for a moment longer than she should have, and the woman next to her bumped gently into her from behind, and she started walking again. The smell of disinfectant hit them before they reached the medical tents. Clean and chemical and sharp in the throat. So different from the smell of the caves, which had been the smell of bodies and stone, and the particular sourness of people eating almost nothing for a very long time. It was a smell that meant someone here was trying to keep wounds clean. Someone here had enough supplies to do that. A woman was walking toward them across the duckboards. She was perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair tucked under a military nurse's cap, and an expression that Fumiko tried to read and found she could not. Not cruel, not soft. Something in between those things that she did not have a word for yet. The woman's uniform was clean and pressed, and she wore captain's bars on her collar, and she walked the way people walk when they have been in charge of difficult situations for a long time and have stopped being rattled by them. She stopped a few feet from the group. Fumiko looked at her, and this woman looked back at Fumiko with an expression that was not assessment and not judgment, but something that combined the two without being either of them. Like she was looking at a problem that needed to be solved correctly and was taking the time to see it clearly before deciding how. "My name is Margaret Hartley," she said. "Everyone calls me Maggie. You are safe here. No one will hurt you." The words meant nothing to most of them, but Fumiko had studied enough English to catch the shape of it. Safe. Hurt. The negation. She translated what she could for the women closest to her, her voice careful, uncertain about some of the words. Then a man stepped forward from beside Hartley, and the group went very still. He was wearing an American Army uniform, corporal stripes, standard issue everything, but his face was Japanese. Not Japanese looking, Japanese. And when he opened his mouth, what came out was Tokyo Standard Japanese, with no regional accent whatsoever, as clean and neutral as a broadcaster's. "I am a translator," he said. "I am here to help you understand what is happening. Nothing else." His name was Watanabe Kenji, 26 years old, born in Hilo, Hawaii. His parents were first-generation Japanese immigrants. He had grown up speaking Japanese at home and English at school, and had spent his entire life existing in the space between two identities without being fully claimed by either one. After Pearl Harbor, his family was sent to an internment camp in the American interior, along with thousands of other Japanese Americans. Watanabe had volunteered for the Military Intelligence Service, a unit composed of Japanese American soldiers who served as translators and interrogators throughout the Pacific Theater. He had done this partly to prove loyalty to the country that was imprisoning his family, and partly because it was the only position that put him anywhere near being able to affect the outcome. He had translated interrogations. He had translated surrender negotiations. He had translated the last words of dying soldiers who wanted to say something to someone who could understand them. He had lived inside other people's language for 3 years. He was very good at standing still while people looked at him with complicated expressions. Fumiko looked at him for a long moment and then asked through him the question that mattered most to her. "What can you promise us?" Hartley did not answer immediately. She stood in the afternoon light and thought about the question. The pause lasted long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "Medical care," she finally said. "Food, safe shelter. That is what I can promise, because that is what I know is true. What happens after the war, where you go, whether your families are safe, I cannot tell you those things, because I do not know them. And I will not tell you something I do not know is true." Fumiko heard this and felt something small and precise click into place somewhere inside her. Not hope, not relief, something more specific than those things. She had spent 3 months receiving promises from men in uniforms. Promises about honor and victory and the glory of sacrifice and the righteous defeat of the enemy. Every single promise had been delivered with absolute certainty, and every single promise had been wrong. What she was being offered now was the opposite of certainty. She was being told, "Here is what I know, and here is what I do not know, and I will not pretend otherwise." She had not heard that in a very long time. She turned to the group behind her and translated Hartley's words as accurately as she could. Then they were led to the shower facilities, a cluster of canvas-walled enclosures on wooden platforms with overhead pipes. Steam rose from inside the nearest one. The group stopped. Chio moved to the front before Fumiko could. She stood and looked at the enclosures, and Fumiko could see her reading the situation, the confined spaces, the unfamiliar environment, the soldiers nearby, all of it. Reading it the way she read cave echoes for the direction of artillery. Reiko spoke before anyone else could. She said quietly but clearly, "I will not take gifts from them. Not even this." Hartley seemed to understand without being told what the hesitation was about. She did not explain. She did not reassure. She did not make any sound at all. She simply walked to one of the shower enclosures, pulled aside the canvas flap, and walked in. The sound of water running, steam rising. Then she walked back out, her hair wet, her expression unchanged, except for something very small around the eyes that might have been patience, or something more than patience. She gestured toward the enclosures. She stepped back. Chio watched this and was quiet for a moment. Then she walked forward and went in. Setsuko was given a small stack of items before she entered. A rough towel, clean clothing, gray cotton military issue adapted for women, and the bar of soap. Pale yellow, hard, smelling of nothing she recognized. She held it in both hands in the steam and looked at it. In Japan, soap had been a rationed luxury since 1943. She had not held a complete unbroken bar since she was 12 years old. She stood there long enough that the woman behind her asked gently if she was all right. She said yes and stepped under the water. The water was warm, not hot, not cold. The specific temperature that is just warm enough to tell your muscles that they can let go. She had not felt warm water in 3 months. She had bathed in whatever was available. Sometimes nothing at all, and her skin had grown a second layer made of cave dust and old blood, and the particular grime of people living in conditions that no training prepares you for. She put the soap under the water, and it foamed white. She rubbed it on her hands, and the foam ran brown, and then less brown, and then nearly clear. She worked it through her hair, and 3 months of debris dissolved and ran past her feet into the drain. Around her, in the other stalls, she could hear other women beginning to cry. Not loudly. Just the quiet kind of crying that happens when the body finally receives something it has been desperate for and does not know how to process the receiving of it. Setsuko did not cry in the shower. She stood under the warm water and thought about her mother. Nakamura Hana, 44 years old elementary school teacher from Naha, who had bathed Setsuko as a child in water heated on a wood stove in a pot with a crack in the handle that her father had fixed with wire and never replaced, who used to sing while she did it. A song from before the war. Something ordinary and old and specific to that kitchen in that house in Naha that Setsuko could not be certain still existed. The soap smelled nothing like that kitchen. It smelled like chemicals and manufacture and a country whose products had flooded the world before the war, and whose soldiers were now outside this canvas wall, waiting with professional patience. She stood under the water until it told her everything it had to tell her, and then she turned it off and dried herself with the rough towel and put on the gray cotton clothing and stepped out into the light. That evening, they were brought to a mess tent with long metal tables. American soldiers sat at other tables eating and talking in the low, exhausted register of people who have been in a difficult place for a long time and have learned to take rest wherever it appears. On the table, in front of the 37 women metal trays, rice, canned vegetables, meat with gravy, white bread, tea, and butter. Butter. Real butter, the color of pale gold, spread thick on the bread in the casual way that the American soldiers did it without thinking, without hesitation, the way you use something ordinary. In Japan, butter had not been available since 1943. People had stood in lines for hours for a portion the size of a thumb. Setsuko watched a young soldier at the next table spread butter on a piece of bread, the way you might watch a magic trick unable to make the ordinary thing be ordinary. No one in the group moved to eat. They looked at the food. They looked at each other. They looked at the food again. The room smelled of things they had not smelled in so long that the smelling of them now was a kind of ache. Reiko said quietly to no one in particular, "If we eat this, what does that make us?" Fumiko picked up her spoon. Her hand was steady. She had learned to make her hands steady in the caves in situations where steadiness was the only thing that could be offered to someone who was suffering, and she used that skill now. She said, "We must stay alive. Whatever comes next, we need to be strong enough to face it." No one spoke, and then someone picked up a spoon, and then another, and then all of them, some quickly and desperately, some with tears moving silently down their faces, some so slowly it looked like they were trying to memorize each bite against the possibility that it might be the last real meal they would ever have. Setsuko ate her rice one careful spoonful at a time. The bread with the butter she ate last. The butter was so rich after months of almost nothing that her stomach did not know what to do with it. She ate it anyway. Then she folded her hands on the table and sat very still for a moment and looked at the empty tray. That night in the tent, set up with rows of canvas cots and clean blankets and actual pillows, Setsuko lay on her back and looked at the ceiling of the tent and listened to the sounds around her. Quiet crying, someone praying, the rustle of the canvas in the night wind coming off the ocean. Somewhere outside, a generator running steadily. She was not going to die tonight. That was the most solid fact available to her, and she turned it over slowly in her mind, examining it from every angle, trying to make it feel as real as it apparently was. She thought about the man who had placed the canteen on the ground and stepped backward. She thought about Hartley, who had walked into the shower to show them it was safe. She thought about the butter on the bread spread without thinking the most ordinary gesture in the world. She thought about every propaganda film she had watched in school, every class, every speech from every officer who had come through the cave with words about honor and sacrifice and the inevitable victory of the empire. Every description of Americans as monsters. None of it matched the canteen on the ground. None of it matched the woman who stepped back and waited. She whispered into the dark above her, the phrase she had used for 3 months in the caves to give herself enough time to take one more breath. Please, not again. But something was different now. She could feel it in the shape of the words as she said them. The words were the same. The meaning had started to shift. She was not sure yet what it was shifting toward. She closed her eyes. The morning bell was a handbell, not a military klaxon, not a shouted order. A handbell rung by an American medic walking between the rows of cots, with the unhurried manner of someone who had decided that the people in this tent had earned the right to wake up gently. Setsuko opened her eyes and for 3 full seconds did not know where she was. Then she knew, and knowing was its own kind of shock, different from the shock of the cave, and different from the shock of the hillside, and different again from the shock of the canteen and the soap and the butter. This was the shock of the morning after. The shock of waking up in a place that was safe and realizing that safety was going to require a completely different set of skills than the ones she had spent 3 months developing. She lay still and listened to the sounds around her. The handbell fading down the row of cots, women stirring, the canvas of the tent moving in the early morning breeze coming off the Pacific. No artillery, no dripping stone, no sounds of men dying in the dark. She had slept for 8 hours without waking once. She could not remember the last time that had happened. Breakfast was rice and canned fruit and tea and white bread, and something she did not recognize at first, a soft, yellow spread served in small paper portions that unfolded. More butter. The American soldiers ate it without looking at it. Setsuko watched one of them use his portion in about 30 seconds and then reach for another, and she thought about her younger brother Haruki, who was 12 years old and who loved sweet things more than any other thing in the world, and who had not had anything sweet in so long that she could no longer remember the last time she had seen him eat something that made him smile. She ate her bread slowly. She saved nothing. There was nowhere to save anything, too. On the third morning, Captain Hartley came to them with Watanabe beside her. She stood before the group and said through Watanabe's careful translation something that none of them had expected to hear. Our hospital is understaffed. We have more wounded than we have people to care for them. You are trained nurses. I want to ask, not order, whether you are willing to work. She paused to let Watanabe finish. Then she continued. You will be paid in camp script. You will work 8-hour shifts. You will be treated as medical personnel. You can refuse. I am asking because I need help and because you are capable of giving it. The tent was quiet for a long moment. Fumiko stood at the front of the group and felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders, the way weight always settled on her shoulders when a decision needed to be made, and everyone was waiting for her to make it. She had not asked for this position. She had simply been the one who kept deciding when others stopped. And somewhere in those 3 months underground, that had become who she was in this group. She looked at the faces around her and saw 3 different things. Some faces showed a cautious willingness, the look of people who needed to have a purpose and had been without one for 3 days. And were beginning to feel the absence of it like a missing limb. Chiyo was one of these. She had been restless since the first morning moving through the tent with the contained energy of someone who was built for action and was finding stillness very expensive. Some faces showed refusal, clear, certain, quiet refusal. Reiko was one of these. She stood with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and her expression said what she did not need to say out loud. And some faces showed something that Fumiko recognized because she had seen it in a mirror for most of her life. Uncertainty. The look of someone who had been told what to think and what to do and what to believe for so long that the experience of being asked a genuine question felt like being handed a tool they did not know how to hold. Setsuko was one of these. Fumiko walked to her. She stood beside the 16-year-old from Naha and asked her quietly, almost privately, "Why did you study nursing?" Setsuko thought about it. Not for show, but actually thought, looking at some middle distance where the answer lived. "When I was 12, my mother was very sick. A doctor came to our house and he did something that made her stop being in so much pain. I wanted to be able to do that for someone else." Fumiko nodded. "That reason has not changed," she said. "A person in pain is a person in pain." Setsuko looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, the small, decisive nod of someone who has found the thing they needed to find. Reiko was the harder conversation. When Fumiko went to her, Reiko did not wait for a question. She said simply, "I will not treat the people who killed our friends." Fumiko did not argue. She sat down beside Reiko on the edge of a cot and was quiet for a moment. And Reiko was quiet too, and the space between them was heavy, but not hostile. Then Fumiko said, "I am not going to tell you that you are wrong. I am going to tell you what my father told me when I was young. He said that a doctor's hands do not belong to any country. They belong to whoever is placing their life in them at that moment. I have held on to that sentence for 3 months in the dark. It is the only thing I am certain of." Reiko said nothing. She did not change her mind that day. The work began the following morning. Setsuko was assigned to the post-operative recovery ward, a large tent with 2 rows of cots, and the particular hushed quality of a place where people were in the process of coming back from something serious. The air smelled of antiseptic and bandaging material, and the specific human smell of bodies healing. She stopped at the entrance. Lieutenant Patricia Donnelly was the nurse in charge of this ward. Donnelly was 29 years old. She was from Boston, Massachusetts. Her younger brother, James, had been 22 years old when he died at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Patricia Donnelly had joined the Army Nurse Corps 8 days later. Not because she was the kind of person who made decisions quickly, but because grief had removed all the options except one. She had served in field hospitals in North Africa, in Sicily, in the Pacific. She had done the work with a professional coldness that the people around her sometimes mistook for toughness, and that was actually something different. It was the psychological equivalent of a tightly sealed container. Everything went inside. Nothing came out. The work got done. When Setsuko stepped into the ward, Donnelly did not look up. She continued what she was doing, which was checking the IV line on a patient in the 3rd cot from the left. Her movements efficient and precise. Her face showing nothing. She did not acknowledge Setsuko's presence in any way. Not with anger, not with hostility. She simply did not acknowledge it the way you might not acknowledge a piece of furniture that had been moved into a room without your input. Setsuko stood in the middle of the ward and looked around. Wounded men in cots, bandaged heads and wrapped limbs, and the particular stillness of people who have had large quantities of pain medication and are resting at the bottom of it. Monitoring equipment. IV stands. The sound of someone breathing with difficulty somewhere at the far end of the tent. She did not know where to start. Then a patient in the cot nearest to her turned his head toward her and pointed at the cup on his bedside table. He wanted water. She understood this without language. She poured water from the pitcher on the table and held the cup while he drank, and that was how she started. The simplest possible thing. The most basic service that nursing required. Water for a person who was thirsty. Donnelly saw this from across the room. She did not say anything, but something in her attention shifted slightly the way attention shifts when it registers something and files it away for later. 3 days later, Setsuko was assigned to the care of a patient named Thomas Grady, private first class. Thomas Grady was 21 years old. He was from Scranton, Pennsylvania, a city built on coal, and his father and his uncle and his grandfather had all worked in the mines, and Thomas had been a miner for 2 years before the war had rerouted his life in the way that it rerouted so many lives in those years. He had lost his left arm below the elbow to artillery shrapnel on the island of Ieshima, a small piece of land off the western coast of Okinawa, the same island where the American war correspondent Ernie Pyle had been killed in April. Grady was alive. The surgeons had made sure of that. But he lay in his cot and looked at the bandaged stump of his left arm with the expression of a man trying to solve a math problem that has no solution. He did not talk much. He ate what was brought to him. He cooperated with the medical procedures. But he was somewhere else most of the time, somewhere behind his eyes, where the calculation was running continuously and the answer kept coming out wrong. A miner needed 2 hands. That was the whole of the problem. Simple total with no available answer. Setsuko came to his cot each morning and changed his dressings and checked his vital signs and brought him water and medication. He watched her work but did not speak to her, not because he was hostile, but because he was too absorbed in the calculation. She was a feature of his day, like the quality of light through the tent canvas, or the schedule of meals present and noted, but not yet connected to anything. On the 4th day, she sat in the chair beside his cot, after finishing his dressings, and looked at him. She looked at his right hand, which was lying open on the blanket. A miner's hand, wide and calloused, and strong, built for work that required grip and force and endurance. His right hand was intact, completely intact. She looked around the ward and found what she needed on the nurse's station across the room. A piece of paper, a pencil. She brought them back and placed them on the blanket beside his right hand. Then she looked at him and made a writing motion with her own hand, slow and deliberate, so there was no question about what she meant. Grady looked at the paper, looked at the pencil, looked at her. She pointed at his right hand, then at the pencil. Then she made the writing motion again He picked up the pencil with his right hand. She watched him hold it, the grip awkward, searching for the position that worked when you only had one hand to manage it. His right hand had spent 21 years assisting his left. It had never needed to lead. He was discovering now what it was capable of alone. He put the pencil to the paper. He wrote slowly. The letters were large and uneven and took more concentration than he was used to giving to something this simple. But they were letters. They were a word. Home. His shoulder dropped 1/4 of an inch. That was all. Just that small release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Setsuko saw it. She had spent 3 months watching people's bodies for the signs that they were still fighting to stay, and she recognized this. He had found something. Not the answer to the calculation, not a solution, but a direction. She nodded once the way you nod when someone has understood something important and moved to the next patient. She did not know what the word said. It did not matter. The work in the surgical tent began separately without planning the way the most significant things often begin. Dr. Robert Callahan was 38 years old from Boston, Harvard trained, and he had spent 6 months in Tokyo in 1938 on an academic exchange program studying trauma surgery. He remembered that city the way people remember places they loved before a war made them into symbols of something else. He remembered the medical school library, which held texts going back 3 centuries. He remembered a particular professor. He remembered late evenings in small tea shops near the campus where the students argued about surgical technique until the proprietor started putting chairs on the tables. He had come back to the United States in late 1938, and then the world had proceeded to make everything he remembered into a before. Fumiko was assigned to assist in the surgical tent on a Wednesday morning when Callahan was short-staffed. She entered and took her position, and when Callahan's hand came up for the first instrument, she placed the right one in it without being told and without hesitation, because she had assisted in hundreds of surgeries in the cave hospitals, and the language of a surgical theater has no nationality. A clamp extended and received. A suture passed hand to hand. The rhythm established itself in the first 10 minutes and did not break. After the case was finished and the patient was being transferred to recovery, Callahan peeled off his gloves and looked at Fumiko across the table. He asked Watanabe, who had been present to translate any necessary communication, "Where did you train? Tokyo Imperial University Medical School," she said. Callahan was quiet for a moment. "Then, which professor?" "Nakagawa Hiroshi," she said. "Senior professor of surgical technique." Callahan looked at her differently then. Not with surprise exactly, with recognition. The specific look of someone who has encountered an unexpected connection to something they thought was entirely lost. "He taught me the closed vascular repair technique in 1938, Callahan said. "I still use it. I use it in this tent." Fumiko heard this and said nothing for a moment. Then she asked the question she needed to ask. Do you know if the university library is still standing? Callahan shook his head slowly. Tokyo is being bombed heavily. I don't know what is left. She looked at him. Why would you care about a library that belongs to a country at war with yours? He thought about this. He did not give her the easy answer. He thought about it genuinely, standing in a surgical tent on an island that had been almost completely destroyed. And then he said, because that knowledge belongs to the next patient, whoever they are, wherever they are. The men who wrote those texts were not thinking about which country would win a war 80 years later. They were thinking about the person bleeding in front of them. That is the only thing that library is about. Fumiko heard this and felt something move in her chest. Not forgiveness, not warmth, exactly. Something more structural than those things like a load-bearing wall shifting slightly to accommodate a new weight. Her father had said something very close to that in a clinic in Tokyo, to a daughter who was young enough then to absorb it completely and old enough now to understand what it had cost him to believe it. The confrontation that had been building between Chio and Reiko finally happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week. Chio had been working in the wound care section and had developed a working relationship with the medic named Corporal James Whitfield, a methodical young man from Georgia who was extremely good at his job and extremely willing to learn anything that might make him better at it. She had shown him a Japanese technique for securing bandaging on large wounds, a method that held more reliably than the standard American approach in cases where movement could not be avoided. Whitfield had learned it in one session and was practicing it with the focused attention of someone who understood that getting this right was the difference between a wound that stayed clean and one that did not. Reiko found Chio as she was leaving the wound care tent. She did not shout. She was not the kind of person who shouted. She said with the careful quietness of genuine anger, "You are teaching them our techniques." Chio stopped walking. Reiko continued. The techniques developed in our hospitals, our schools, our tradition of medicine. You are handing them to the people who are destroying us. Chio turned around. She said, the next person Whitfield bandages will heal better because of what I showed him. That is what I care about. Reiko, the next person he bandages will be an American soldier. Chio. Maybe, and maybe someone from Okinawa, and maybe someone from somewhere else. I do not know who his next patient will be. Neither do you. She paused. Then she said something she had been holding for a long time since before the caves, since before the mobilization order, since before the battle for Okinawa had begun. My family has been on this island for generations, she said. Not in Tokyo, not in Osaka, here. And in these 3 months, I watched Japanese soldiers push Okinawan civilians out of shelters to make room for troops. I watched people from this island treated as less valuable than the army that was supposedly here to protect them. So when you ask me who I owe my loyalty to, I want you to understand that the question is more complicated for me than it is For you. Reiko had no answer for this. There was no answer for it. It was simply true, and the truth of it was too uncomfortable to respond to directly. She walked away. Neither of them mentioned the conversation again. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and the air between them was different after that, thinner and more honest, the way air sometimes becomes after the thing that was in it has finally been named. The convoy arrived on the 28th of July. More than 100 casualties from ongoing operations transported by truck and ambulance over roads that had been carved through the wreckage of the battle. The vehicles came in one after another and did not stop coming, and the organized efficiency of the field hospital became something faster and louder and more desperate. The controlled frenzy of medical people doing the work that requires them to think faster than feeling. Fumiko was in the surgical tent within minutes. Setsuko was in the pre-operative area. Chio was in the wound triage section, where the immediate decisions had to be made about who went where and how quickly. And Reiko was standing at the entrance to the main tent. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Setsuko saw her when she turned to get supplies, and she noted Reiko's position and the expression on Reiko's face, which was not the expression of someone observing. It was the expression of someone deciding. Then Reiko walked in. She picked up a pair of surgical scissors from the nearest supply table and moved to the cot where a young soldier lay with both legs of his uniform soaked through with blood, and she began to cut. Her hands did not shake. Her face showed nothing. She worked with the same clean efficiency she had brought to every task she had ever been given, because she was very good at this. She had always been very good at this, and the person bleeding in front of her needed someone who was good at this right now. No one said anything to her. There was no time to say anything to her. The work absorbed everything. Setsuko was in the pre-operative area when a soldier was brought in who was perhaps 19 years old. He had been badly wounded in the chest, and he had lost significant blood. And he was in the particular state that severe blood loss produces, which is a state of being simultaneously very present and very far away, fully conscious, but loosening from the world, 1 degree at a time. He grabbed her wrist, not aggressively, desperately, the way people grab onto things when they are afraid of floating away. He said something in English that she did not understand, but she understood the question. She had heard it in Japanese 100 times in the caves. She had heard it from boys who were 17, and boys who were 30, and boys who were every age in between. She had heard it so many times that she had learned the shape of it in every face that asked it. Am I going to die? She took his hand with both of hers. She looked at him. She held his gaze steadily, the way she had learned to hold the gaze of people who were frightened, because looking away confirmed the fear, and looking directly at it sometimes did not. She said in Japanese, knowing he could not understand the words, "The doctors here are very good. The supplies here are real. You have a better chance in this tent than anywhere I have ever worked." He could not understand the words, but she did not look away while she said them, and her hands did not let go of his, and something in her manner communicated what the words could not. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly. They took him to surgery 2 minutes later. She did not know what happened after that. There was no time to know. The next patient was already there. That evening, after the last of the convoy casualties had been stabilized or transferred or had received everything that could be done for them, the medical staff moved through the aftermath of the day with the slow deliberateness of people running on the last of their reserves. Setsuko went back to the nurse's tent and lay down on her cot without changing out of her work clothes. Around her, the other women were doing the same, collapsing, rather than lying down, the particular collapse of people who have used everything available and have arrived at the bottom of it. She stared at the ceiling of the tent. Her mind would not stop running the numbers. 23 people. The count that Watanabe had given her at the end of the day. 23 of the casualties from the convoy were expected to survive their wounds and recover. 23 people who would go home, who would write letters, who would sit at tables with their families and eat meals and argue about ordinary things and grow old in the particular way that people grow old when they have survived something that might have killed them. She wrote in the small notebook she had bought at the canteen with her first week's wages. She wrote, "Today I helped keep 23 American soldiers alive. I do not know how to feel about this. I know that I will do the same thing tomorrow. I know that the boy who grabbed my wrist was 19 years old and afraid of dying, and that I am also not yet 17 and also afraid of dying, and that in that tent at that moment we were the same kind of thing. I do not know what to do with all of this, but I am writing it down so that I do not forget it." She closed the notebook, put it under her pillow. In the cot, 2 spaces away, she heard Reiko breathing, steady and even, already asleep or close to it. The sleep of someone who had made a decision and used everything she had in the making of it. On the morning of August 6th, Watanabe was called into Hartley's office before the regular shift began. He was in there for 15 minutes. When he came out, the nurses were already gathering for the morning briefing. He stood in front of them, and his face carried the expression that Setsuko had come to recognize, the expression of a man who has received information he is required to deliver, regardless of what delivering it costs him. He said, "I need to tell you something about what happened yesterday in Japan." He told them about Hiroshima. 1 bomb, 1 city, gone. More than 100,000 people. The number was too large to process the way ordinary numbers are processed. It sat in the air of the tent like a physical weight that no one knew how to lift. The room was entirely still. Setsuko stood and heard the word Hiroshima and felt nothing at first. The shock was too complete for feeling. Then everything at once. She walked out of the tent, not running, just walking, and went behind the supply shed at the edge of the compound and stood with her back against the corrugated metal wall and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Her aunt lived in Hiroshima, had lived, a school teacher. The woman who had taught Setsuko to write her first letters when she was 4 years old, who had a habit of tucking pencils behind both ears and forgetting them, who smelled of chalk and green tea and the particular lavender soap she had ordered from a catalog before the war made catalogs impossible. Setsuko stood behind the supply shed for 10 minutes. Then she went back to work. That evening, Callahan found Fumiko sitting outside the surgical tent on an ammunition crate that someone had dragged out for use as outdoor seating. The sun was going down over the ocean in colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were: orange and deep rose and the specific blue of altitude that appears at the western edge of a sunset when the light is going and the dark has not yet arrived. Callahan sat down nearby. He did not speak immediately. They sat in the fading light, two people who were both sitting with something that had no good resolution and who were not going to pretend otherwise. Finally, Callahan said through Watanabe, who had followed at a quiet distance, "I do not know what to say. I am sorry, not for the surrender that will come from this, for everything it took to get here, for the people in that city." Fumiko was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did not drop the bombs." He said no. She said, "And the boy in the third cot with the head wound did not choose to be born in America. And the men who died in our caves chose nothing except to answer when their names were called the same as the men who died in your hospitals." She stopped. The sunset continued without them. Then she said, "I keep thinking about the library, the one you mentioned." He said, "At the university." She said, "My professor had a collection of surgical texts going back 400 years, handwritten. He used to say that every page was a conversation between a doctor who had been dead for centuries and a patient who had not been born yet. That the knowledge moved forward through time in that direction, always forward, always toward the next person who needed it." She paused. If it burned, she said, the conversation stopped. Not just for Japan, for everyone who would have read those pages. Callahan said, "I will find out. When this is over and I can get information, I will find out what survived." Fumiko looked at him then directly. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it matters. Medicine does not have sides. I learned that from a professor in Tokyo in 1938, and I have not found a better answer since." They did not speak again that evening, but they sat there until the light was completely gone. Two people on an island that both of their countries had used as a place to break things, sitting with what remained. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki. Watanabe told them in the same way he had told them about Hiroshima. Standing in front of the group with the face of a man doing a necessary and terrible job. Another city, another bomb, another number too large to hold. Watanabe said the words, and then he stopped speaking and stood there. And for a moment, something broke through the professional surface he maintained. His parents were Japanese. His cousins were Japanese. He had spent 3 years translating a war between his two countries, standing in the space between them belonging fully to neither. And now he was standing in front of a group of Japanese women, telling them that Japan was being unmade from the inside out, one city at a time, and finding it there in his face, briefly, before he put it away again, and straightened his back, and asked if there were any questions. There were no questions. The morning of August 15th, the radio in the camp came on at 6, and something about the sound was different before anyone could say exactly why. Setsuko was already awake. She had been lying on her cot listening to the early morning sounds of the camp when the change came through the speakers. The quality of silence between broadcasts shifting into something heavier, more significant, the way air changes before weather. Then the voice. Watanabe appeared in the entrance of the nurse's tent shortly after. He said, "The Emperor has spoken on the radio this morning. For the first time in history, Japan has accepted the terms of surrender." The tent was completely quiet. Then Watanabe read the relevant passage translated slowly, giving each phrase time to land. We must endure the unendurable. We must accept the unacceptable. Reiko sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. Her legs simply stopped working, and she sat down where she was in the space between the cots and looked at her hands in her lap. Chio was standing near the back of the tent. She turned and looked toward the south, toward Naha, toward the cliffs, toward the caves, toward the place where more than 100,000 people had died in the preceding months, for a war that had just ended with the Emperor's voice on a radio saying words that no emperor had ever said before. One of the younger women asked the question that no one else had said yet. We were told to die rather than surrender. But the Emperor has surrendered. So what were all the deaths for? She did not ask it as a question. It came out as a flat statement, the kind that emerges when the question is too large to hold the shape of a question. No one answered. The answer did not exist in any form that language could carry. Outside the tent, the American side of the camp had a different quality. Some soldiers were embracing. Some were sitting quietly by themselves. A few were crying, the particular crying of men who have been holding something tightly for a very long time and have just been told they can put it down. Nobody cheered near the tent where the Japanese nurses were. Someone had made a decision about that, or the restraint had come naturally from the understanding that what was relief on one side was something else entirely on the other. The morning after the surrender announcement, all 37 nurses arrived at their assigned stations at the scheduled time. This was not discussed. There was no meeting, no group decision, no conversation about whether to continue. They simply appeared each at her station at the time she was expected and began. Setsuko thought about this later, about what it meant to choose to keep doing something when the structure that had required you to do it had dissolved. The war was over. The obligation, such as it was, had ended. They could have stayed in the tent. No one would have forced them out. They came anyway. She thought it was probably the clearest statement any of them ever made about who they actually were. Clearer than anything said or explained or justified. You are the thing you keep doing when you no longer have to do it. Grady was sitting up in his cot when she arrived that morning. He had his paper in his lap and the pencil in his right hand, and he had been writing. She could see from the doorway that the letters were smaller than they had been in the first session, more controlled, the hand learning its new role with the focused incrementalism of someone who was made for hard work and had simply redirected it. He looked up when she came in. He held out his hand, the right one, and opened it. In his palm was a small medal, silver the size of a large coin worn smooth at the edges from handling. She picked it up carefully. On one side was the image of a man carrying a child across water. She did not know who it was, did not have the religious vocabulary to identify the figure, but the image itself was clear. Someone carrying something precious through something dangerous. Grady spoke slowly. She caught individual words. Safe. Home. This helps. She understood. She held the medal for a moment and felt the weight of it small and real in her palm, and thought about what it meant that this man who had lost his left arm to her country's artillery was pressing a protective talisman into her hand for the journey back to what remained of her home. She reached into her pocket and took out her mother's letter, the one she had been carrying since April. She folded it carefully and tore a small piece from the corner, a piece with no words on it, just the paper itself. Japanese paper. From Okinawa, from her mother's hand. She placed it in Grady's palm and closed his fingers around it. Nihon, she said. Japan. He looked at it. He folded it with the same care she had given the medal and placed it in the breast pocket of his hospital shirt. The pocket where she had seen American soldiers keep photographs of the people they were fighting to return to. 2 days before the transport ship was scheduled to arrive, Donnelly came to find Setsuko after the evening shift. In all the weeks they had worked in the same ward, they had not exchanged a direct conversation. Donnelly had maintained her professional distance with the consistency of someone who had decided on a policy and intended to honor it. She found Setsuko outside the mess tent after dinner. She said, "Sit with me for a minute." They sat on the low concrete step of the foundation that had once been the schoolyard building. The evening sky was the particular blue of the Pacific after sunset, deep and clear, with the first stars appearing in the east over the ocean. Donnelly reached into her breast pocket and took out a photograph. She did not hand it to Setsuko. She held it up so Setsuko could see it. A young man in a navy uniform. Dark hair. A wide smile. Eyes that were recognizably similar to the eyes in Donnelly's face, the family resemblance visible even in a small photograph in evening light. James Donnelly said, "Just the name." Setsuko looked at the photograph. She looked at Donnelly. Then she reached into her own pocket and took out her mother's letter, the one she had been carrying since April, the one that was now missing a small piece from the corner. She held it up the same way Donnelly had held up the photograph, not offering it, showing it. "Okasan," she said. "Mother." They sat like that for a moment, each one holding up something precious in the evening light, each one showing the other what they were carrying, what they had been carrying all along underneath the professional distance and the silence. Then Donnelly put the photograph back in her pocket. She said, "He would have been 26 this year." Setsuko did not understand the words, but she heard the would have been in the tone, in the shape of the sentence, in the soft destruction at the center of it. She said in Japanese, knowing it would not be understood, "My aunt was in Hiroshima. She was a teacher. She is not coming back either." They sat together on the concrete step until the stars were fully out. They did not become friends. That word was not available to them, but they had shown each other what they were carrying, and that was something. In the arithmetic of loss, sometimes that is the most that can be offered. The ship left on the 28th of September. Captain Hartley stood at the dock. She shook each woman's hand as they boarded. Not formally, not as a superior officer releasing personnel, as a person saying goodbye to people she had worked alongside and had in the course of that work come to know in the specific and irreducible way that you know people when you have spent weeks doing difficult things together in close quarters. When she reached Fumiko, she held her hand a moment longer. She said, "You are an exceptional surgeon. Not an exceptional Japanese surgeon, an exceptional surgeon. I want you to know that someone who has watched you work believes that without qualification." Fumiko bowed. The gesture was automatic, the product of a lifetime, but it carried weight. She said, "You taught me that the enemy has a face. That has always been true, but it took you to make me see it." When Chio reached Hartley, the captain said, "You are the best nurse I have ever worked with, and I have worked with a great many nurses." Chio stood still for a moment. Then she said in English carefully, with the precision of someone placing a word they have practiced in exactly the right position. "Thank you." It was the most complete sentence she had spoken in the language. Hartley nodded once. Watanabe was the last person Setsuko spoke to before she boarded. He was standing to the side of the dock, not in line, occupying the slightly separate position that she had noticed. He always occupied the position of someone who belonged to both things and therefore stood at the edge of each. She stopped in front of him. She said, "Your family. Do you know if they are all right?" He looked at her. Then he smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile in the entire time she had known him, and it was small and tired and genuine in the way that things are genuine when they have cost something. He said, "I don't know yet. I will find out when I get home." She said, "Which home?" He thought about it. "Both, maybe," he said. "I think it will take both." She nodded. She understood this better than he might have expected, because she was from Okinawa, which was not quite Japan, and not quite anything else, which had been a kingdom once, and a prefecture later, and was now a ruin that two countries had fought over without asking the people who lived there what they wanted. She went up the gangway. From the deck, she watched Okinawa get smaller. The southern cliffs were visible, the ones that held the cave system's gray limestone against the blue of the sky and the deeper blue of the water. She could not see the specific cave from this distance. The island had so many. The island was made of them. She kept watching until it disappeared into the horizon, and there was nothing but ocean in every direction. Japan appeared 2 days later. From the deck in the gray morning light, Setsuko looked at her country and could not find the version of it she had left. Yokohama should have been a city of lights and commerce and the particular busy energy of a major port. What she saw instead was the skeleton of that city buildings standing as hollow frames against the sky, the port infrastructure damaged, and partially reconstructed people moving on the docks with the slow deliberateness of people doing the necessary work of surviving the aftermath of something that had cost them almost everything. She stood at the rail and held the silver medal in her palm and thought about everything she was carrying back into what remained of her country. The canteen on the ground, the 3 steps backward, the warm water, the butter on the bread, Grady's pencil moving across the paper, Donnelly and the photograph of James, Callahan and the library that might or might not still exist. Hartley walking into the shower stall to show them it was safe. She would carry all of this without being able to explain it because the explanation was too complicated for a nation that was going to need simple things for a while. But she would carry it. Her mother was in a refugee settlement west of Naha. The reunion happened in a canvas tent in a field that had been an orchard before the battle. Nakamura Hana, 44 years old, was sitting outside the tent on a low stool when Setsuko walked across the field toward her. Hana stood up slowly with the careful movement of someone whose body had been through things that had changed the way it moved. She stood up and looked across the field at her daughter walking toward her, and her hands came up to her face. They held each other without speaking. Setsuko could feel her mother's bones through the thin fabric of her shirt. She could count the vertebrae of her spine with her fingers. Hana had always been a sturdy woman, someone who carried things without complaining, who managed what needed managing. That woman was still present, but diminished, as though the material of her had been reduced by degrees over the past year, until only the essential structure remained. Hana pulled back slightly to look at her daughter's face. She touched Setsuko's cheek with the back of her hand. "You look healthy," she said. How is this possible? Setsuko thought about everything she could say to that question. She thought about the mess tent and the food on the metal trays. She thought about the cot with the clean blanket. She thought about the work and the long shifts and the hand she had held in the pre-operative area while a 19-year-old asked her without words whether he was going to die. She said, "People took care of me." Her mother accepted this. She was too tired for more complicated answers, and Setsuko understood that and was grateful for it. Fumiko returned to Tokyo and found the skeleton of what had been her family's neighborhood in Shinjuku. The house was standing. Her mother was alive. Her father had died in the March fire bombing in the same city where Callahan had spent those 6 months learning to love Japanese medicine and Japanese tea and Japanese arguments about surgical technique that lasted until someone put the chairs on the tables. She found work in a small clinic in Shibuya, and she did the work that needed doing, which was caring for people with malnutrition and tuberculosis, and the infections that accumulate when a population has been living under conditions of sustained deprivation. She did not tell anyone about the months in the American field hospital. The story was too complicated for a country that was learning how to be defeated, which required its own particular kind of energy and did not leave much room for complexity. But in the clinic, when patients came to her, frightened and withdrawn, and not yet ready to trust, she did something that she had learned not in medical school, but in a tent on a hillside in July of 1945. She placed whatever she was offering on the table between them and stepped back. She gave them room to come to her at their own speed. She waited. She used that technique for 40 years without ever explaining where it came from. Chio went home to the northern part of Okinawa, where her family had survived largely intact, because the heaviest fighting had concentrated in the south. She did not go into hospital work. She became the woman her village called when a baby was coming and the roads were bad, or the hour was wrong, or the situation was complicated. She delivered children for 30 years. When mothers were frightened in the hardest moments, Chio had a phrase she said in the old Okinawan dialect, "Nuchi du takara." Life is the treasure, yours and this child's, both. She said it every time. It always meant the same thing, and it always helped. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, an American veterans organization sent letters to former Japanese medical personnel who had worked with American field hospitals during the occupation of Okinawa. They were organizing a reunion. Most did not respond. The distance was still too great, the complexity still too unresolved, the wounds still present, even if they had been quiet for a long time. Fumiko, 64 years old, and a retired professor of surgery in Tokyo, sat with the letter for 3 days before she wrote back. At the reunion in Hawaii, in a conference room in a hotel that overlooked the Pacific, a young woman read the letter aloud in English, translated from Fumiko's Japanese. The room was full of people in their 60s and 70s, American medical veterans and a handful of Japanese survivors, all of them carrying 40 years of what comes after. Hartley was there, 71 years old, her hair completely white, sitting near the front with her hands folded in her lap. The letter said, "I learned in the summer of 1945 that the face of the enemy is the face of another person trying to survive. I learned that kindness can exist even in war. I learned that hands that heal do not look at nationality before they decide to heal. I was too young when I learned these things to understand their full weight. I have spent the 40 years since then teaching them to other people in whatever ways I could find. Thank you for the canteen on the ground and the 3 steps backward. Thank you for asking rather than ordering.
Thank you for treating us as people who were capable of something at a time when we had been taught that we were only capable of dying well.
I am sorry it has taken me 40 years to say this in words. I said it every day for 35 years in the classrooms where I taught. Every time I told a student that the patient in front of them was a person first and a diagnosis second. Every time I taught someone to place an instrument and wait for it to be received rather than forcing it into a hand that was not ready. You taught me that. All of you together in those months on Okinawa. I hope you have been at peace." Hartley sat in the front row and looked at the floor while the letter was being read. When it was finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up and said in a voice that had spent 40 years maintaining its professional composure and was finding the task somewhat more difficult this morning than usual. She put the right instrument in my hand every time. Before I asked. Every single time. That was the whole of what she said. It was enough. Back in Naha in the autumn of 1990, Setsuko sat in her kitchen with her granddaughter Yuki, who was 17 years old and who was about to begin her training as a nurse. Yuki had her grandmother's eyes and her father Haruki's stubbornness, and the particular combination of the two that made her likely to be good at this work. She asked her grandmother, "Were you scared?" "In the war," Setsuko said, "I was scared of everything. Every day." Yuki said, "How did you keep going?" Setsuko said, "I had a phrase I repeated to myself. I don't know exactly why it helped. It just gave me enough time to take one more breath, and one more breath was usually enough to get to the next thing." Yuki said, "What was the phrase?" Setsuko looked at her granddaughter across the kitchen table. Outside the window, the October sky over Okinawa was the deep, clear blue that comes after a typhoon has passed and taken everything difficult with it and left only the clean air behind. She said, "Please not again." That was it. In the beginning, I was asking for myself. Please, don't let the painful thing happen again. Please let me survive this. She paused, but over time, she said the meaning changed. I didn't notice when it changed. It just did. By the end, I wasn't asking for myself anymore. I was asking for everyone. Please don't let us forget what we learned. Please don't let us go back to the version of the world where the person on the other side is so different from us that we do not owe them the basic things we owe to anyone who is breathing. Yuki thought about this. She said, "Do you think the prayer was answered?" Setsuko looked out the window at the sky, at the blue that came after the storm. "Not enough," she said. "But we have to keep asking."